A Sioux chef's restaurant earned America's most prestigious culinary honor. 800 miles away, Pine Ridge families opened commodity boxes instead. But who really gets to eat the $85 decolonization? One dinner at Owamni costs roughly 1 week's wages on Pine Ridge. That is not a footnote. That is the entire argument. Sean Sherman is Oglala Lakota, born 1969 on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He grew up with commodity cheese, canned beef, white flour, the architecture of a food system built to replace indigenous ones. He spent decades asking one question: what did Lakota people eat before that box arrived? The answer became a restaurant, a cookbook, a nonprofit, a James Beard Award, and a genuine fight inside indigenous communities about what decolonization actually means. His restaurant is called Owamni, named for the Dakota word for the waterfall at St. Anthony Falls on the Mississippi River. That waterfall is sacred to the Dakota people whose land Minneapolis sits on. Sherman did not choose that location for the view. He chose it because placing an indigenous restaurant on indigenous sacred ground is itself a political act. But here is the part where a celebration becomes a conversation, and the conversation gets genuinely hard. To understand why this debate matters, you have to understand what Sherman actually built and what his critics actually mean. Neither side is wrong. That is what makes this worth 30 minutes of your time. Sherman's menu at Owamni follows a single organizing principle: remove every ingredient introduced after 1492. No wheat flour, no dairy, no cane sugar, no beef, no pork, no chicken. What remains is what was always there: bison, wild rice, cedar, sumac, chokecherry, wojape, tepary beans, blue corn. A plate of cedar-braised bison short rib with foraged mushrooms and chokecherry reduction arrives at your table. The smell of cedar smoke and darkberry moves through the dining room before the plate touches the surface. The chokecherry is astringent and sweet at once, a flavor that has no French culinary vocabulary because it predates French culinary vocabulary. That specificity is the point Sherman has been making since 2014, when he founded the Sioux Chef Catering Company in Minneapolis. 3 years later, his cookbook, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, was published by University of Minnesota Press and won a James Beard Award for Best American Cookbook in 2018. By 2021, Owamni by the Sioux Chef opened on the west bank of the Mississippi River. Entrees priced between approximately $18 and $38. A full dinner experience, running $60 to $85 per person before drinks. On June 13, 2022, at the Lyric Opera of Chicago, Sean Sherman walked to the James Beard podium. Best New Restaurant, the first indigenous restaurant to win in the award's 33-year history. 33 years longer than the entire working career of most chefs in that room. He held the medallion and told the audience that the win belonged to every native cook who was ever told their food was not cuisine. The applause was long, and now comes the part the food magazines mostly skipped. 800 miles southwest of that stage, Pine Ridge Reservation sits in the southwestern corner of South Dakota. The median per capita income on Pine Ridge is approximately $8,768 per year, according to the 2020 Census Bureau estimate. That is roughly $168 per week. One dinner at Owamni, $60 to $85 before drinks, costs approximately half a week's income for a reservation resident. A single $32 entree represents about 4 hours of work at South Dakota's minimum wage of $10.80 in 2022. The math does not soften with context. This is not an accident of market forces. It is a structural fact about what fine dining costs and where indigenous poverty sits. Approximately 22 to 24% of American Indian and Alaska Native people live below the federal poverty line. The USDA Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, FDPIR, serves approximately 90,000 households per month across 276 tribal organizations. 90,000 households, roughly the entire population of Dayton, Ohio, eating from commodity boxes every month. Those boxes contain canned beef, processed cheese, shortening, white flour, the exact ingredients Sherman excludes from Owamni's menu on decolonial grounds. The people most dependent on those colonial ingredients are the people who cannot afford the restaurant built to replace them. That sentence is the center of this entire debate. But what came next? The response from indigenous food advocates: nobody covers this part. Brian Yazzie is Dene, from the Navajo Nation, a chef and food sovereignty advocate who works at the commodity kitchen level. His argument is precise. Decolonizing food must reach the 526 boarding school-era communities still dependent on USDA commodity programs. 526 communities, more than all the Starbucks locations in the state of California combined. Yazzie told Civil Eats in 2021 that a James Beard Award does not feed those communities. His point is not that Sherman's work is wrong. His point is about where the resources, the attention, and the funding should flow. Food sovereignty, in Yazzie's framework, is not a tasting menu. It is access to land, seed, water, and traditional knowledge at the community level. Crystal Wapepa is Kickapoo Nation. She runs Wapepa's Kitchen in Oakland, California's Fruitvale neighborhood. She opened in 2021, the same year. Owamni opened with a deliberate model: fast casual, affordable, indigenous food at $8 a plate. Her griddle smells of blue corn and cast iron. The line outside includes indigenous elders, customers using EBT cards, families on lunch breaks. A sign on her door reads, "All nations welcome." Wapepa has said plainly that fine dining is not the revolution. She is not dismissing Sherman. She is proposing a different answer to the same question. Who does decolonized food actually reach? 2 kitchens, 2 models, 1 movement. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. Sociologist Psyche Williams-Forson at the University of Maryland has documented a pattern that applies here with uncomfortable precision. Her research on Black Southern food found that aspirational cuisine can simultaneously elevate cultural prestige and widen class barriers. The culture gets recognized. The community that originated it often cannot afford the recognition. Applied to indigenous food, the pattern produces a specific discomfort. Sherman's work elevates Oglala Lakota food knowledge to the level of James Beard. That elevation is real. The cultural dignity it restores is real. But the family on Pine Ridge who grew up eating wojap does not suddenly have access to the restaurant serving it at $32 a plate. Think of it this way. Imagine a museum that finally displays your culture's art in a beautiful gallery. The recognition is genuine and meaningful, but your grandmother still cannot afford the $25 admission ticket. That is not a hypothetical. That is the lived structure of cultural capital in a country with indigenous poverty rates where they are. Sherman supporters hear this argument and respond with something the critics sometimes underweight. Owamni is not the only thing Sherman built. It is the most visible thing. In 2018, alongside the Sioux chef, Sherman founded the Indigenous Food Lab, a nonprofit educational program in Minneapolis. The Food Lab runs workforce training programs with sliding scale tuition, subsidized through grants, specifically targeting Native American food entrepreneurs and community cooks. By the end of 2023, approximately 100 Native food business participants had graduated from those programs. The restaurant funds the visibility. The nonprofit funds the access. That is Sherman's stated model. His argument is that these are not competing functions, they are complementary ones, operating at different scales for different purposes. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead. Owamni sources its ingredients from native-run farms and harvesters across the region. Dream of Wild Health is an Ojibwe-led farm in Ham Lake, Minnesota, growing heritage seeds and traditional vegetables that supply the restaurant. Ramona Farms in Sacaton, Arizona, run by the Akimel O'odham people, supplies tepary beans, a drought-resistant legume cultivated in the Sonoran Desert for thousands of years. Every sourcing decision routes money back into indigenous agricultural networks that otherwise struggle for market access. This is the economic multiplier argument. Owamni is not just a restaurant, it is a node in a supply chain that employs majority native staff and funds native producers. A $32 bison entree, in this reading, is a wealth transfer mechanism moving money from non-native diners into indigenous food economies. The Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash planted together, is an ancient agricultural system that is engineering, not accident. The corn grows tall and provides a structure. The beans fix nitrogen into the soil the corn depletes. The squash spreads wide and suppresses weeds. Each plant feeds the others. The yield per acre exceeds what any single crop produces alone. Sherman's supporters argue his model works the same way. The fine dining restaurant feeds the nonprofit feeds the community feeds the food sovereignty movement. The interdependence is structural, not incidental. But holding Wapapa and Yazie's position requires sitting with a number that does not move. 90,000 commodity box households per month. 100 Food Lab graduates per year. The scale gap between who needs food sovereignty and who is currently being reached by any indigenous fine dining model is not bridged by a supply chain argument. It is not bridged by a nonprofit with 100 graduates either, however meaningful those 100 graduates are. The people most dependent on colonial food infrastructure are not being reached at the pace their dependence demands. That is not an accusation. It is an arithmetic fact. Both sides have blind spots, and fairness requires naming them. The critics of Sherman's model sometimes treat cultural prestige as if it has no material value. It does. For 33 years, the James Beard Foundation awarded its Best New Restaurant Prize without once recognizing an indigenous kitchen. 33 years of American culinary culture saying through omission that indigenous food is not cuisine. Sherman's win does not feed anyone on Pine Ridge, but it changes what a generation of young Oglala Lakota cooks believe is possible for them. Representation in prestige institutions has downstream effects on funding, on media coverage, on which culinary traditions get taught in culinary schools. Those effects are slow, they are real. The critics are right that visibility is not the same as access. They are sometimes less careful about the fact that visibility precedes access historically, consistently, across every food justice movement. The other side is equally true. Sherman's defenders sometimes use the food lab as a rhetorical shield that deflects the access critique rather than answering it. Pointing to a nonprofit with 100 graduates while 90,000 households eat from commodity boxes monthly is a mismatch of scale that the shield does not cover. The Indigenous Food Lab is valuable. It is not sufficient as a response to the scale of the problem. And there is a harder question underneath this debate that almost no one is asking directly. Who gets to decide what decolonizing food looks like? Is it the Oglala Lakota chef who built a restaurant on Dakota sacred land and won a national award? Is it the Kickapoo chef feeding elders with EBT cards in Oakland? Is it the Dene advocate arguing the work belongs in commodity kitchens on the Navajo Nation? Are all three of them right? Can all three models coexist without one delegitimizing the others? This is where the debate lives. Sean Sherman told Bon Appetit in 2022, "We're not going back to the past. We're using the past to build a better future for Native people." That sentence is doing significant work, and it is worth slowing down inside it. Not going back to the past is an answer to critics who romanticize pre-contact food systems as if they were static or universally accessible. Pre-contact Lakota food was not a restaurant. It was a seasonal, migratory, community-based system that required land, movement, and collective knowledge that colonization systematically destroyed. You cannot restore that system by removing wheat flour from a menu. The land is still gone. Using the past to build a better future is Sherman's claim that Owamni is not nostalgia, it is infrastructure. A culinary language that predates colonization, rebuilt in a contemporary kitchen, documented and taught so it does not disappear again. That framing is serious and defensible. But WAPEPA's counterframing is equally serious. The future Sherman is building is currently most accessible to the people least in need of food sovereignty. Not because Sherman chose that, because the structural costs of fine dining in America and the structural depth of indigenous poverty sit at opposite ends of the same problem, and no single kitchen resolves that gap. Both of those facts are true simultaneously. The site of Owamni adds another layer that the access debate sometimes flattens. The restaurant sits at Bedote, the sacred confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers in Dakota cosmology. This is not a metaphor. This is the exact ground that Dakota people consider spiritually foundational to their world. Placing an indigenous restaurant on that ground, naming it in the Dakota language, sourcing from Dakota and Ojibwe and Akimel O'odham producers, that is territorial reclamation, enacted through a meal. The question of whether a $60 dinner can constitute an act of sovereignty is not answered by the price tag alone. But it is also not answered by dismissing the price tag. Fry bread is the ghost that haunts this entire conversation, and it needs to be named directly. Fry bread is made from white flour, salt, baking powder, and lard, or shortening every ingredient on Sherman's colonial exclusion list. It became a staple on reservations in the 1860s, when the U.S. government relocated the Navajo Nation and provided commodity rations: white flour, processed lard, sugar, salt. Fry bread was born from forced removal. It is what you make when the land is gone, and the rations are what they give you. It is also, for millions of Native people alive today, the smell of their grandmother's kitchen, the taste of home, the food at every powwow, every feast, every funeral. It is colonial, and it is beloved. Both things are true at the same time. When Sherman excludes fry bread from Owamni's menu on decolonial grounds, some Native visitors feel seen, their traditional food finally centered. Other Native visitors feel something closer to erasure, as if the food their grandmothers made with those rations is being declared illegitimate. This is not a small dispute. This is the exact fault line the decolonized food movement is walking. Crystal Wapapa serves blue corn tortillas at her counter, not fry bread, as a replacement that is affordable and traditional, without being exclusionary in the way a fine dining menu can be. Her model says, "You do not need a James Beard Award to decolonize your plate. You need $8 and a cast iron pan." Sherman's model says, "You need the James Beard Award too, because without it, nobody outside the community ever takes the food seriously enough to fund the change." That disagreement is structural. It is not personal. In movements for cultural reclamation, the first institution to gain mainstream legitimacy often does so by making the culture legible to people who already have money. That legibility is a translation. And all translations leave things out. What Owamni translates bison, cedar, chokecherry, wild rice, it translates beautifully, rigorously, and with deep cultural integrity. What it cannot fully translate is the communal nature of indigenous food systems, which were never designed around individual plates at individual tables with individual price tags. The Lakota concept of mitakuye oyasin, all my relations, the interconnection of all living things, is embedded in the food system Sherman is trying to restore. It is harder to embed in a $65 tasting experience for two than it is in a community kitchen where elders teach teenagers to harvest wild rice. This is not a criticism of Sherman's sincerity. It is a structural observation about what fine dining can and cannot carry. The most honest thing either side of this debate can say is, the restaurant is one tool. One tool is not a food system. A food system requires land. It requires seed sovereignty. It requires tribal control of agricultural policy. It requires dismantling the USDA commodity program's hold on reservation diets. None of that happens at a restaurant, not even a James Beard Award-winning one. But none of it happens without cultural legitimacy either. In 2024 and beyond, this debate is not staying in food media. It is moving into USDA tribal consultation sessions, into Indigenous-led nonprofit budget meetings, into tribal council chambers. The question of where food sovereignty funding should flow to fine dining prestige projects or community-level commodity replacement programs is a live policy dispute. 574 federally recognized nations have different land bases, different traditional food systems, different levels of food insecurity, different relationships to federal commodity programs. A model that works in Minneapolis on Dakota sacred land near a James Beard following audience may not be the model that works on the Navajo Nation, or in rural Alaska, or on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. Brian Yazzi's insistence that decolonization must happen at the commodity kitchen level is not a rejection of what Sherman built. It is a demand that success be measured by who gets fed, not who wins awards. Crystal Wapapa's fast casual model is not proof that fine dining is wrong. It is proof that a different scale is possible, and that the choice of scale is itself a political decision. Sherman's Indigenous Food Lab is not proof that the restaurant's pricing is irrelevant. It is proof that he understands the access critique well enough to build something alongside the restaurant that tries to answer it. None of these three people are wrong. All three of them are insufficient alone. The food sovereignty movement needs Owamni's cultural legitimacy and Wapapa's community access and Yazie's commodity kitchen advocacy simultaneously. The debate is not about which one is right. It is about how much of the movement's limited resources, attention, and funding goes to each, and that question, which model gets the grant, which gets the profile, which gets the James Beard nomination, is a real question with real stakes. It does not have a clean answer. Here is what the 2022 moment actually contained, held all at once. A man born on one of the most economically distressed reservations in the United States stood at the most prestigious culinary podium in that country. He got there by rebuilding a food system that colonization spent centuries dismantling methodically, ingredient by ingredient, supplier by supplier. He named the award after every native cook the industry had ignored for 33 years. At the same moment, 90,000 indigenous households were opening commodity boxes that month, boxes containing the exact ingredients his menu refuses. At the same moment, Crystal Wapapa was pulling blue corn off a cast-iron griddle in Oakland for $8 a plate. At the same moment, Brian Yazzie was in a commodity kitchen on a reservation arguing that this is where the revolution actually happens. All of this was occurring in the same country, in the same week, inside the same movement. The James Beard Award was real. The chokecherry reduction was real. The commodity box was real. The cast-iron griddle was real. Cultural recognition and material deprivation are not opposites. They can coexist in the same movement, in the same moment, without canceling each other. But coexistence is not the same as resolution. There is no clean negative case. Crystal Wapapa is not proof that Sean Sherman is wrong. There is no clean affirmative defense. The Indigenous Food Lab does not neutralize the scale gap between its 100 graduates and 90,000 commodity households. The steelman of Sherman's position holds that cultural legitimacy is infrastructure. It builds the foundation other forms of access stand on. The steelman of his critics holds that infrastructure built on $65 plates cannot be the primary delivery mechanism for food sovereignty to the people who need it most. Both steelmans hold. That is the condition this story leaves you in. If you are an Indigenous community member watching this, you may have already picked a side. You may have eaten at Owamni and felt your food finally seen. You may have opened a commodity box this month and felt the distance between that table and this award as something physical in your chest. You may hold both of those things in the same body, in the same week. That is not confusion. That is what living inside a movement looks like before it resolves. Food is never only food, not for any culture, not at any price point. It is memory, identity, land, sovereignty, grief, pride, and the daily negotiation between what was taken and what remains. The question this story leaves you with is not which one is right. The question is, what does decolonization cost, and who gets to decide who can afford it? That question is still open. It will be answered not at an award ceremony, but at a tribal council budget meeting, or a USDA consultation, or a community kitchen where someone is teaching a teenager to harvest wild rice, or maybe at an $8 counter in Oakland, where the line stretches out the door and the sign still says, "All nations welcome." That question is still open. It will be answered not at an award ceremony, but at a tribal council budget meeting, or a USDA consultation, or a community kitchen where someone is teaching a teenager to harvest wild rice, or maybe at an $8 counter in Oakland, where the line is long and the door says, "All nations welcome." If you are in the debate culture community, here is the resolution framework this story refuses to give you. There is no clean negative case. Crystal Wapapa is not proof that Sean Sherman is wrong. There is no clean affirmative defense. The Indigenous Food Lab does not neutralize the scale gap between its 100 graduates and 90,000 commodity households. The question is, what does decolonization cost, and who gets to decide who can afford it? That question is still open. It will be answered not at an awards ceremony, but at a tribal council budget meeting, or a USDA consultation, or a community kitchen where someone is teaching a teenager to harvest wild rice. Or maybe at an $8 counter in Oakland, where the line is long and the door says, "All nations welcome." Subscribe if that question kept you thinking. The next video is already waiting.